The dying planet. The sky above was no longer blue. It had turned a dull, lifeless gray, as if even the heavens themselves had given up on the planet below. The land, once fertile and green, was now barren, cracked like the surface of an ancient desert. The oceans that had once shimmered with life were now stagnant pools of salt water. It was a planet in decline. The very heart of it was dying. The people who lived there could feel it in their bones, a sinking, heavy dread that never left. Everywhere they looked, signs of decay were apparent. Cities were abandoned, crops failed year after year, and the air itself seemed to carry a sense of finality. In the capital city of Yelharis, the last remaining council of leaders gathered in a large, dimly lit chamber. The room, once filled with grand conversations and plans for the future, was now silent. A single, fragile holographic image flickered above the table. It was the planet's distress signal, blinking weakly, as if even the technology itself knew the end was near. The council members, their faces drawn and tired, sat in a circle around the table. They had tried everything. Nothing had worked. Diplomacy with neighboring planets had failed. Trade routes had been closed off. Even the most advanced technologies of their civilization had been unable to reverse the damage. They were running out of time, and they knew it. "We can't last much longer," said General Riva, her voice trembling. Her normally commanding presence had been reduced to a hushed whisper. "The people are losing hope. We've tried everything we could. We've exhausted every option." The council members exchanged glances, their faces pale and weary. Everyone had given their all to save their planet. But it wasn't enough. The planet's resources were drained. Their military was weak, unable to defend against the threats that lurked at their borders. There were rumors of other species eyeing their planet, waiting for it to collapse so they could take it for themselves. The once great nation was on the verge of collapse. "We have no choice," said the council leader, an elderly alien named Eldrin. His voice was soft, but there was a finality in it. "The distress signal must go out. If anyone in the galaxy is still listening, we need help. We can't survive alone. We must appeal to the stars themselves." The others nodded in solemn agreement. They had never considered sending out a plea for help. It felt like surrender, like admitting that they had failed. But they had no other option. Their people were dying, their planet was dying, and without outside help, there was no future for them. "Prepare the transmission," Eldrin ordered, standing slowly. His body was frail, but his mind was sharp. "This may be our final hope." As the council began to prepare the transmission, a sense of dread settled over the room. The message they were about to send would be broadcast across the galaxy, reaching countless worlds. Would anyone answer? And if they did, would they be saviors or predators? Eldrin turned to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. He had lived through decades of peace, prosperity, and progress, but now it was all coming to an end. As the signal was prepared, a sense of finality washed over the chamber. The planet's leaders knew this could be their last chance. The distress signal, their final cry for help, would soon reach the farthest corners of the galaxy. But would anyone come to their aid? The transmission was sent. Outside the council chamber, the city of Yelharis was eerily quiet. The streets were empty. The markets, once bustling with activity, were now abandoned. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the soft whisper of wind sweeping through the deserted streets. The people of the planet were waiting. They had no choice but to wait. Some still held on to hope, believing that someone, anyone, would come to help them. Others, however, had already given up. They had seen too much suffering, too many deaths, and they had lost all faith. But the message had been sent, and the call was out there. Somewhere, someone might hear it. In the darkest corners of the universe, many civilizations had heard of the Deathworlders. The legends of these brutal, savage warriors were whispered in hushed tones. They were not the type to be easily summoned. In fact, most believe the Deathworlders to be mythical, creatures too dangerous to even exist. But if there was a chance, just a chance, that they might hear the call, the aliens of Yalharis would risk it. As the transmission continued to broadcast into the void of space, hope flickered in the hearts of the desperate. There was nothing more they could do. They had reached out to the stars. And somewhere, deep in the dark reaches of space, the Deathworlders might just be listening. The planet waited. The universe watched. And the fate of a civilization hung in the balance. The response. The distress signal had been sent. The fate of the planet, and perhaps its people, now rested in the cold, vast expanse of space. Across the galaxy, worlds continued on with their everyday lives, unaware of the quiet desperation echoing through the stars. The people of Yalharis could only wait, clinging to the fragile thread of hope that someone might hear their plea. Days passed. The once bustling capital city, now eerily silent, seemed to grow quieter with each passing moment. The streets were abandoned, shops locked up, and the citizens, though still alive, had lost the will to move. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Were they truly forgotten? Had the message fallen on deaf ears? Council leader Eldrin walked the corridors of the capital's central command center, the weight of the responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Every moment he spent waiting was a moment of dread. The universe was vast. Who knew if anyone would come? There was no guarantee that the message would even be received. But he had no choice but to believe. He had to believe someone, somewhere, might respond. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A loud, sharp tone pierced the room, followed by the unmistakable hum of a communication channel being activated. Eldrin froze, his heart racing in his chest. The room fell silent as every member of the council turned toward the communication terminal. The signal they had sent had been answered. But who? Who was it? Leader Eldrin. The voice on the screen crackled. It was deep, rough, like the rumble of distant thunder. "We have received your distress signal." The alien leaders looked at each other, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and hope. There was no way to predict what kind of response they would get, but this voice was unlike any they had expected. Eldrin stepped forward cautiously, trying to steady his breath. "Who are you?" His voice came out more shakily than he had intended. "We are desperate. Our planet is dying, and we have no one else to turn to." "We." A figure appeared on the screen, emerging from the shadows of a dimly lit bridge. The being was humanoid, but there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. Its skin was dark, like the deepest abyss of space, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural red. It wore heavy armor, covered in battle scars and dents that told tales of countless wars fought. This was no peaceful civilization offering help. This was someone different. "You have called for aid," the figure growled, its voice thick with authority. "We are the Deathworlders, and we answer the call." The room was frozen in shock. The Deathworlders, the legends, the myths, creatures so fearsome that no one dared to speak of them lightly. Rumors had always circulated about these warriors, tales of their incredible power and unmatched brutality. Some said they were nothing more than a fearsome race of predators, but others believed they were a force of nature, impossible to stop. For the first time in years, Eldrin felt a glimmer of hope. You are willing to help us?" he asked, almost afraid to believe it. "We have no resources, no defense left. Our planet is dying. We can offer you nothing but our gratitude." The Deathworlder's red eyes glowed brighter as it leaned forward, its voice dripping with an ominous tone. "Gratitude means little to us. We will aid you in exchange for something else." A cold shiver ran down Eldrin's spine. He could feel the weight of the words. What would they want? "What? What do you ask?" he managed to say, trying to steady himself. The Deathworlder's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You will pay for your survival in ways you cannot yet understand. But make no mistake, our help comes at a price. You will owe us. Your people will owe us. and the universe will remember the cost. Eldrin's heart skipped a beat. He had feared this moment, feared that the Deathworlders would demand something too terrible to imagine. Yet he had no choice. The planet was dying, and he had to take the risk. But the terms, what were they? What did the Deathworlders truly want? You may not understand now, the Deathworlder continued, but we will ensure your survival. We will destroy those who threaten you. We will make your enemies fear you. But in return, we will come back when we are ready to collect. The message cut off abruptly, leaving the council in stunned silence. The room was filled with an eerie stillness as the gravity of the situation settled in. The leaders of Yelharis exchanged uneasy glances. They had asked for help, and now it had come. But what had they truly invited into their lives? The Deathworlders, General Riva muttered under her breath. The legends were true. Eldrin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had believed in the possibility of salvation, but now that it had arrived, it came with an unsettling sense of dread. Would they be saved, or were they merely pawns in a game much larger than they could ever comprehend? As the communication terminal went silent, the reality of their situation became clear. The Deathworlders had answered the call, but they had done so on their own terms. And now, the aliens of Yelharis would have to live with the consequences. In the distance, through the viewports of the command center, the first shadow of the Deathworlder fleet emerged from the darkness of space. Their massive ships glided into the planet's orbit, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The fate of Yelharis was no longer in their hands. It was in the hands of the Deathworlders. And whatever price they would demand, the planet would have to pay. The arrival of the Deathworlders. The first sighting was a whisper, a small blip on the scanners, no larger than the size of a distant asteroid. But then, as time passed, that small blip grew larger, and the planet's inhabitants began to realize the full scope of the approaching force. Yelharis, once a thriving world of vibrant life, now stood at the edge of annihilation, awaiting a force they barely understood. The Deathworlder fleet arrived in the dark void of space, a vast armada unlike anything the people of Yelharis had ever witnessed. They were massive ships, shaped like dark, menacing shadows, gliding through space with unnatural precision. The ships radiated power, their hulls scarred by countless battles and the brutal passage of time. They had been forged in war, hardened by the coldest corners of the galaxy. From the command center, the leaders of Yelharis watched the ships enter their orbit. The colossal vessels loomed on the monitors, each ship bristling with weaponry and fortified with layers of advanced armor. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. These were no ordinary allies. They were warriors, predators in a universe full of prey, and the price of their help had yet to be fully revealed. "They're here," General Riga whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. She had known that the Deathworlders would come, but seeing their fleet in person, so close, filled her with a sense of dread. There was something about their presence, something that made the air itself feel thick and heavy. Eldrin, the council leader, stood in silence, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of their decision bore down on him. The fleet was real, and their aid was at hand, but at what cost? What would they demand in return for their intervention? He had little time to dwell on that thought. The communication terminal hummed to life once more, its cold, mechanical voice cutting through the tension. "Leader Eldrin, we have arrived. Prepare for our landing." The words sent a chill down his spine. It was as though the Deathworlders had always known what was coming. They didn't just offer help. They commanded it. There was no room for negotiation, no asking for terms. They had come, and the people of Yelharis had no choice but to comply. "Prepare the city for their arrival," Eldrin ordered, his voice firm despite the unease that churned in his gut. "We'll meet them at the landing site." The council room was alive with hurried activity as preparations were made. Security forces were put on high alert, and the city began to buzz with tension. The streets, once desolate, now saw hurried movement as the populace began to react to the arrival of the Deathworlder fleet. They didn't know whether to rejoice or to fear the impending storm. After all, who could truly know what a Deathworlder wanted? Hours later, the sky overhead darkened. The massive ships hovered just above the surface of Yelharis, casting long, menacing shadows. Their engines hummed with quiet power, and the people of the city stood frozen in awe and fear. The ships began their descent slowly, deliberately. They landed in the outskirts of Yelharis, shaking the ground with their immense weight. The force of their landing stirred up dust and debris, but still, the people did not move. Then came the sound. A low, mechanical hiss reverberated through the air as the hatchways of the ships opened. The first figure emerged, followed by another, and then a dozen more. They were not like the peaceful alien ambassadors the people of Yelharis had expected. They were tall, menacing figures, clad in heavy, battle-worn armor that glinted in the weak light of the planet's dying sun. Their eyes glowed faintly red, a sharp contrast against the darkness of their helmets. Each movement they made was calculated, precise, and terrifying. Their presence commanded the attention of everyone who watched from the city below. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet as they moved, and every step they took felt as though the weight of their collective might was pressing down on the planet itself. "These are the Deathworlders," General Riva muttered, barely able to contain the awe and fear that she felt. "This is who we called upon." Eldrin swallowed hard. "We have no choice but to welcome them. They are our only hope." As the Deathworlders assembled in a perfect, terrifying formation, the lead figure stepped forward. It was larger than the others, standing a full head taller. The figure's armor was darker, more elaborate, and its presence was suffocating. It raised its helmeted head to the sky, as though sensing something. Then, slowly, it turned its gaze toward the council and the leaders standing in front of the ships. Eldrin felt his heart skip a beat as the Deathworlder's red eyes locked with his own. There was no warmth in those eyes, no kindness, just cold calculation. "Leader Eldrin," the figure's voice boomed, deep and resonant. "You have called for our help, and we have answered. But remember, this is not charity. You will not be free of the cost for long. You will owe us." The word sent a shock through the council. They had known there would be a price, but to hear it spoken aloud in such a manner was unsettling. Eldrin nodded solemnly, his throat tight with uncertainty. "We understand," he replied, trying to hide the fear in his voice. "What will you have us do?" The Deathworlder leader looked down at him with what seemed like disdain, as if the question itself were beneath them. "When the time comes, you will know. But for now, your planet is safe. We will protect it. We will crush any who threaten it." As the leader of the Deathworlders stepped back, the entire fleet's shadow seemed to shift, as if the planet itself were breathing under the weight of their ships. A feeling of unease washed over Eldrin as he realized that while they might be safe for now, the true cost of this help was still far from clear. The people of Yelharis, watching from their streets and homes, were torn between relief and terror. The Deathworlders had arrived, and their power was undeniable. But what would be asked of them in return? What had they just bargained for? The future of Yelharis, for better or worse, was now tied to the Deathworlders, and only time would tell what the consequences of that decision would truly be. The price of protection. The Deathworlder fleet had landed, and with it, the ominous weight of their presence settled over Yelharis. As the days passed, the people couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold, something far beyond their comprehension. The air was thick with tension as the Deathworlders took control, imposing their will on the planet in ways that neither the Council nor the population had anticipated. For the first time in years, Yelharis felt secure. The planet's enemies, once a constant threat to its existence, were now on the run. The Deathworlders' power was undeniable. They had crushed rebel forces with ruthless efficiency, leaving nothing but scorched earth in their wake. The skies were now clear of enemy ships, and the people of Yell Harris could breathe a little easier. But with each passing day, the unease grew. General Rava, standing on the balcony of the command center, watched the vast fleet hovering over the planet's surface. She saw the Deathworlders walking among the people, their towering forms casting long, dark shadows on the ground. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. There was no escaping them. They had become an integral part of life on Yell Harris, but for how long? The people of the planet had begun to feel a strange sense of loyalty to these warriors. In their darkest hours, the Deathworlders had answered their call and saved them. They had done the impossible, driving off their enemies with brutal precision. But Riva couldn't shake the nagging question that had been haunting her since their arrival. What would the Deathworlders ask for in return? She wasn't the only one who felt this way. Eldrin, the council leader, spent sleepless nights in his office, his mind racing with the consequences of their bargain. The Deathworlders had promised to protect Yell Harris, but there was always the underlying sense that this protection wasn't free. There was a cost, a debt that would come due when the time was right. But when would that be? And what would they demand? The Deathworlders had made it clear that they didn't work for free. They had told the council that there would be a price, but they had not said what it would be. Eldrin couldn't help but wonder if they were simply biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike when they had Yell Harris exactly where they wanted them. But for now, the planet was safe. The immediate threat had passed, and the people began to rebuild. New infrastructure was constructed, and life slowly returned to normal, though with an edge of anxiety that lingered in the air. The streets were still filled with the rumble of Deathworlder patrols, and no one dared to protest. The Deathworlders didn't have to announce their authority. It was simply understood. One evening, Eldrin received a summons. It was from the Deathworlder leader himself. The time had come. He stood before the council, his face a mask of uncertainty. The room was silent as the communication terminal hummed to life. On the screen appeared the face of the Deathworlder leader, tall, imposing, and unyielding. His red eyes glowed like burning coals in the darkness. "You have had your peace," the Deathworlder's voice rumbled, "but the time for repayment has arrived." Eldrin felt his heart race. This was it. The moment they had all feared. He tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. What do you ask of us?" The Deathworlder leader's gaze never wavered. "We will take what we are owed. The debt you owe is not something that can be repaid in material wealth or resources. It is something far more precious." Eldrin's stomach sank. He had feared this moment, but now that it was here, he had no idea what to expect. What could be more precious than their resources, their gratitude, their very lives? The Deathworlder leader continued, his voice as cold and final as the void of space itself. "You will provide us with your finest warriors. The strongest, the fiercest. Your best will join us, and they will fight in our wars. They will be trained by us, honed into weapons. They will serve as our soldiers, our shock troops, in battles across the galaxy." The words hit Eldrin like a physical blow. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale with shock. "You want our soldiers?" Eldrin asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "But we are a peaceful people. We have no army." The Deathworlder leader tilted his head, as though considering the question. "You have an army now. We have given you the strength to survive, to protect yourselves. But your debt is not just about protection. It is about service. You will fight for us, and when the time comes, you will stand by our side in the wars to come. Do not forget, we answered your call. Now you will answer ours." The room fell silent. The gravity of the request was immense. Eldrin felt a sense of betrayal. Their planet had been saved, yes, but now their people were being asked to sacrifice the one thing they had held dear, their freedom. To serve the Deathworlders in their wars was to abandon the very principles they had fought to protect. "Will you fight?" The Deathworlder leader's voice echoed through the room. Eldrin stood frozen, his mind reeling. He looked around at the faces of the council. Some seemed torn, while others were clearly disturbed. There was no way to know how the people of Yelharis would react to this demand. Would they agree to fight, or would they rebel against the very beings who had saved them? As the transmission ended and the screen went black, Eldrin felt a sense of dread settle over him. The Deathworlders had given them protection, but at what cost? Would they be able to live with the consequences of their bargain? And more importantly, would they be able to live with the future the Deathworlders had planned for them? The price of protection. The Deathworlder fleet had landed, and with it, the ominous weight of their presence settled over Yelharis. As the days passed, the people couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold, something far beyond their comprehension. The air was thick with tension as the Deathworlders took control, imposing their will on the planet in ways that neither the Council nor the population had anticipated. For the first time in years, Yelharis felt secure. The planet's enemies, once a constant threat to its existence, were now on the run. The Deathworlders' power was undeniable. They had crushed rebel forces with ruthless efficiency, leaving nothing but scorched earth in their wake. The skies were now clear of enemy ships, and the people of Yelharis could breathe a little easier. But with each passing day, the unease grew. General Reva, standing on the balcony of the command center, watched the vast fleet hovering over the planet's surface. She saw the Deathworlders walking among the people, their towering forms casting long, dark shadows on the ground. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. There was no escaping them. They had become an integral part of life on Yelharis, but for how long? The people of the planet had begun to feel a strange sense of loyalty to these warriors. In their darkest hours, the Deathworlders had answered their call and saved them. They had done the impossible, driving off their enemies with brutal precision. But Riva couldn't shake the nagging question that had been haunting her since their arrival. What would the Deathworlders ask for in return? She wasn't the only one who felt this way. Eldrin, the council leader, spent sleepless nights in his office, his mind racing with the consequences of their bargain. The Deathworlders had promised to protect Yelharis, but there was always the underlying sense that this protection wasn't free. There was a cost, a debt that would come due when the time was right. But when would that be? And what would they demand? The Deathworlders had made it clear that they didn't work for free. They had told the Council that there would be a price, but they had not said what it would be. Eldrin couldn't help but wonder if they were simply biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike when they had Yelharis exactly where they wanted them. But for now, the planet was safe. The immediate threat had passed, and the people began to rebuild. New infrastructure was constructed, and life slowly returned to normal, though with an edge of anxiety that lingered in the air. The streets were still filled with the rumble of Deathworlder patrols, and no one dared to protest. The Deathworlders didn't have to announce their authority. It was simply understood. One evening, Eldrin received a summons. It was from the Deathworlder leader himself. The time had come. He stood before the council, his face a mask of uncertainty. The room was silent as the communication terminal hummed to life. On the screen appeared the face of the Deathworlder leader, tall, imposing, and unyielding. His red eyes glowed like burning coals in the darkness. "You have had your peace," the Deathworlder's voice rumbled. "But the time for repayment has arrived." Eldrin felt his heart race. This was it, the moment they had all feared. He tried to maintain his composure, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. What do you ask of us?" The Deathworlder leader's gaze never wavered. "We will take what we are owed. The debt you owe is not something that can be repaid in material wealth or resources. It is something far more precious." Eldrin's stomach sank. He had feared this moment. But now that it was here, he had no idea what to expect. What could be more precious than their resources, their gratitude, their very lives? The Deathworlder leader continued, his voice as cold and final as the void of space itself. "You will provide us with your finest warriors, the strongest, the fiercest. Your best will join us, and they will fight in our wars. They will be trained by us, honed into weapons. They will serve as our soldiers, our shock troops, in battles across the galaxy." The words hit Eldrin like a physical blow. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale with shock. "You want our soldiers?" Eldrin asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "But we are a peaceful people. We have no army." The Deathworlder leader tilted his head, as though considering the question. "You have an army now. We have given you the strength to survive, to protect yourselves. But your debt is not just about protection. It is about service. You will fight for us, and when the time comes, you will stand by our side in the wars to come. Do not forget, we answered your call. Now you will answer ours." The room fell silent. The gravity of the request was immense. Eldrin felt a sense of betrayal. Their planet had been saved, yes, but now their people were being asked to sacrifice the one thing they had held dear, their freedom. To serve the Deathworlders in their wars was to abandon the very principles they had fought to protect. "Will you fight?" The Deathworlder leader's voice echoed through the room. Eldrin stood frozen, his mind reeling. He looked around at the faces of the council. Some seemed torn, while others were clearly disturbed. There was no way to know how the people of Yelharis would react to this demand. Would they agree to fight, or would they rebel against the very beings who had saved them? As the transmission ended and the screen went black, Eldrin felt a sense of dread settle over him. The Deathworlders had given them protection, but at what cost? Would they be able to live with the consequences of their bargain? And more importantly, would they be able to live with the future the Deathworlders had planned for them? The reluctant decision. The days that followed the Deathworlders' demand were filled with tension and unrest. News of the request spread quickly across Yelharis, reaching every corner of the planet. People gathered in groups, discussing what the Deathworlders had asked for, and a sense of unease began to settle over the population. The once calm streets now hummed with whispers of rebellion, resistance, and defiance. Eldrin sat in his office, his head in his hands, as the weight of their decision pressed on him. The transmission from the Deathworlder leader replayed in his mind. "You will fight for us, and when the time comes, you will stand by our side in the wars to come." The words echoed in his ears, each repetition making the reality more unbearable. The council had met countless times since the demand was made, but no solution had emerged. They had no army, no warriors, and now the very existence of their planet was tied to the Deathworlders. They had come to save Yelharis from annihilation, but at what price? The people of Yelharis had known peace for so long, and the idea of sending their sons and daughters into battle for a race of ruthless warriors seemed unthinkable. But as the days wore on, the situation grew more dire. The fleets of enemy ships that had once threatened their planet had not gone away entirely. They had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It was only a matter of time before they returned in greater numbers, and the Deathworlders had made it clear, without their help, Yelharis would not survive another attack. The council had no choice but to comply. They had been given a second chance, a lifeline that they couldn't afford to waste. The Deathworlders would protect them, but only in exchange for soldiers, young men and women to fight in their endless wars. Yelharis, a peaceful planet, was being dragged into a conflict it had no part in. Eldrin understood the brutal logic behind it, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. As the sun set over the horizon, Eldrin stood before the council once more, his expression grim. The time had come for the final decision. "We have no other choice," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the entire planet's future. "We must honor our agreement." General Riva, who had been silent for most of the council's meetings, stood up. Her face was drawn, her eyes heavy with the burden of what they were about to ask their people to do. "Are we sure this is the right decision?" she asked. "We're sending our children to fight in wars we don't understand, wars that have nothing to do with us. Can we really live with that?" Eldrin met her gaze, his own heart heavy with doubt. "We don't have the luxury of choice, General. If we refuse, the Deathworlders will leave. The enemies will return, and we will be left to face them alone, with no protection, no hope. We cannot let that happen." Riva nodded reluctantly, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the decision. "I understand, but I still don't like it." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke out against the decision. The consequences of refusal were too great, too horrifying. No one was willing to risk the extinction of their people. And so, the decision was made. The next few days were filled with preparations. Flyers were distributed across the planet, and mass meetings were held in every city. Eldrin and the council addressed the people, explaining the necessity of their decision. They spoke of the Deathworlders' protection, of the enemies that still lingered on the horizon, and of the price that had to be paid for survival. But even as Eldrin spoke, he could feel the discontent in the air. The people were divided. Some understood the gravity of the situation and accepted the bargain, but many could not. They could not fathom the idea of sending their loved ones into battle, to fight for beings they barely understood. There were protests in the streets, arguments in the marketplaces, and even some who openly declared they would never serve the Deathworlders. Despite the unrest, the recruitment began. The people of Yalharis were asked to volunteer, to offer up their best warriors. The young men and women who had once dreamed of peaceful lives, of farming and science and art, were now being asked to trade their futures for survival. Some of them, motivated by duty, stepped forward without hesitation. Others, filled with fear and confusion, were coerced into joining by their families, their leaders, and the looming threat of the Deathworlders. The first group of soldiers was gathered, their names called out by the council. They were fitted with the armor provided by the Deathworlders, their weapons sharpened and prepared. They were trained quickly, given just enough time to understand how to fight, how to survive in a war that was not their own. In the training camps, the young soldiers were taught to obey without question, to follow the Deathworlders' orders without hesitation. As the recruits were sent off, Eldrin watched from a distance, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He had led them down this path. He had made the decision, and now the people of Yalharis would bear the consequences. He tried to reassure himself that they had no other choice, that this was the only way to ensure their survival. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had sacrificed something far more precious than their freedom. The Deathworlders' ships were preparing to leave the surface, their massive forms hovering above the planet, ready to carry the first wave of Yalharis soldiers to distant battlefields. Eldrin stood with General Riva, watching the fleet take off into the sky. There was no turning back now. The people of Yalharis had made their choice, and as the ships disappeared into the vastness of space, Eldrin knew that the future of his planet and his people was no longer in their hands. The debt had been paid, but at what cost? The first battle. The days following the recruitment were quiet, yet every passing hour seemed to weigh heavier on the hearts of Yalharis people. The first wave of soldiers had already left, and their families watched them go with a mix of pride and dread. The Deathworlders had promised to leave the Yalharis soldiers to their first battle, one that would test their mettle and show the galaxy their worth. The soldiers were nervous, unsure of what lay ahead, but they had no choice but to march forward. The planet's skies, once calm and serene, were now filled with the looming presence of the Deathworlder ships. From the ground they looked like giants, their dark hulls cutting through the atmosphere like shadows. The soldiers, standing in formation, watched as the ships moved, casting their long shadows across the planet's surface. They were part of something bigger now, something terrifying. As the first wave of soldiers prepared to depart, General Riva stood at the command center, studying the battlefield's layout. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She had become a leader, a symbol of the strength that Yalharis had been forced to adopt. The Deathworlders had made it clear, if they were going to survive, they needed to embrace the ways of war, and they needed to do it now. "We need to move fast," General," one of her officers said as he approached. His voice was filled with concern. "The Deathworlders' fleet is moving at full speed. If we don't follow their lead, we'll miss our chance to strike first." Riva nodded grimly. They had no time to waste. The enemy forces were scattered across the galaxy, but the Deathworlders had given them a chance to fight on their terms. The plan was simple. They would strike hard, fast, and without mercy. The Deathworlders would lead the charge, but the Yalharis soldiers would follow, supporting their allies and proving themselves in the process. "We move now," General Reva ordered, her voice steady, though her heart pounded with uncertainty. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a test of everything Yalharis had become since the Deathworlders arrived. They had been thrust into a war they never wanted, and now they had to fight or perish. The ships lifted off one by one, disappearing into the vastness of space. The soldiers felt the weight of their situation as they were carried off toward an unknown world, the fear of what they might encounter clawing at their minds. They were not warriors by nature, but they had been trained quickly, hardened by necessity. The war was coming for them, whether they were ready or not. As the fleet traveled through the stars, the quiet hum of the engines filled the silence. There were no words exchanged between the Yalharis soldiers as they prepared for what lay ahead. The Deathworlders moved in their own way, silent and purposeful, but their eyes never left the Yalharis. They were watching them closely, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The journey to the battle site took only a few days, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the vacuum of space, each minute weighed down with the anticipation of the conflict ahead. When they finally arrived, the sight that greeted them was like nothing they had ever seen before. The battlefield was a barren, desolate planet, one that had been ravaged by years of war. The ground was scorched and cracked, and the skies above were filled with the debris of destroyed ships. Enemy forces were already on the planet's surface, their own ships scattered across the field, ready to engage. The Deathworlders' ships descended from the sky, their powerful engines shaking the ground as they landed with military precision. Yalharis soldiers stood in formation, looking out at the enemy with a mix of fear and resolve. General Riva stood at the front of the troops, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This battle would determine whether or not their people would survive in this galaxy, whether they could coexist with the Deathworlders, or if they were merely pawns in a larger, much darker game. She glanced over at the Deathworlder leader, standing tall and unwavering. The leader's crimson eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Riva saw something that wasn't cold indifference. There was approval in those eyes. They were ready. The order came swiftly. The Deathworlders charged first, a relentless wave of soldiers moving with an intensity that left the Yalharis soldiers in awe. Their power, their speed, it was overwhelming. The Yalharis, trained but untested, hesitated for just a moment. They had never fought a battle like this before, and the fear that had been building inside them now had a face. The Deathworlders turned to them, their leader giving a single nod of approval. That was all it took. With grim determination, the Yalharis soldiers followed, charging into the battle alongside their new allies. The air was thick with gunfire and the sound of explosions as the two forces clashed against the enemy. For the first time, the Yalharis soldiers felt the true weight of war. The enemy they fought was unlike any they had encountered before, ruthless, merciless, and well-trained. But they were not alone. The Deathworlders moved through the enemy ranks like predators, tearing through their lines with terrifying efficiency. And as the Yalharis soldiers fought alongside them, something changed. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a cause, for their people, for their planet. The battle was brutal and unforgiving. But as the day wore on, the tide began to turn. The enemy forces faltered as the combined might of the Yalharis and Deathworlders pushed them back. The enemy's resolve was breaking, and with it, their forces began to scatter. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was littered with the remains of the fallen. The Yalharis soldiers, exhausted and bloodied, stood alongside the Deathworlders, who remained as stoic and unshaken as ever. The battle was won, but the cost was high. Many had died, and many more would be scared by what they had seen. General Riva looked out over the battlefield, her heart heavy. The Deathworlders had delivered on their promise, and Yalharis had proved itself in battle. But the price of that victory was not one they could ever undo. They had taken the first step into a future they had never imagined. The price of victory. The dust of the battlefield had settled, but the weight of the victory hung heavy in the air. The battle had been brutal, fierce, and relentless, but the Yalharis soldiers had fought alongside their Deathworlder allies and emerged victorious. The enemy forces, once so certain of their triumph, were now scattered and broken, retreating into the vast expanse of space. The planet, which had once teetered on the edge of destruction, now stood tall, at least for the moment. General Riva stood amidst the rubble, her boots sinking into the blood-soaked earth as she surveyed the aftermath. The sight before her was both victorious and heartbreaking. Bodies littered the ground, both Yalharis and enemy alike, and the stench of smoke and death filled the air. The cost of this victory was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The Yalharis soldiers, while triumphant, were not without their scars. Some had been wounded, others had lost their lives, and even those who had survived were forever marked by the horrors they had witnessed. The calm, peaceful world they had known was gone now. There was no returning to the way things had been. The reality of war had made itself known in the most unforgiving way. Riva walked among her troops, offering what comfort she could. She stopped by a young soldier, no older than 19, who was sitting on a fallen piece of debris, his face a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. His hand shook as he tried to wipe the blood from his face, but his efforts were in vain. The carnage, the violence, it was all too much for him. "Is this what we signed up for?" the soldier asked quietly, looking up at Riva, his eyes haunted. Riva sighed deeply, sitting beside him. "No," she admitted. "This is not what any of us imagined, but it's the reality we face now. We didn't choose this path, but now we must walk it to the end." The soldier nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the ground as if to process the weight of her words. In his heart, he knew the truth. Their victory, though necessary, had come at a great cost. The Yalharis people had been forced into a war they never wanted, and now that they had fought and won, the repercussions would follow them for the rest of their lives. Riva rose, her heart heavy with the burden of command. The victory they had won today would be celebrated by some, but for many, it would remain a bittersweet memory. The people of Yalharis had fought to survive, but in doing so, they had lost a part of their innocence. The true price of this war was something they had yet to fully understand. As the Yalharis soldiers gathered around, the Deathworlders stood off to the side, their crimson eyes watching with an unreadable expression. They had won the battle for Yalharis, but they had also taken what they needed: soldiers, strength, and power. The Yalharis were no longer simply civilians. They had been hardened by war, transformed by necessity into fighters. The Deathworlders had kept their word, but the future of Yalharis was no longer in their hands. Riva approached the leader of the Deathworlders, her steps cautious. The leader stood tall, his massive form casting a shadow over her. The usual coldness in his gaze softened for a moment as he acknowledged her presence. "General," the Deathworlder leader said in his deep, guttural voice, "you have done well. The Yalharis have proven their worth." Riva didn't know how to respond. Part of her felt gratitude for the Deathworlders' protection, while another part felt resentment. They had saved her people, yes, but at what cost? The Yalharis were no longer the peaceful beings they had once been. They had been shaped by the violence of war, forced to sacrifice parts of their humanity in exchange for survival. "Thank you," Riva said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "But this victory comes at a price. The people of Yell Harris are not warriors by nature. We will need time to heal. The Deathworlder leader nodded, his expression unreadable. Time is something you may not have. There are many more battles to fight, General. The war is far from over. Riva's heart sank. She had known this, of course, but hearing it from the leader of the Deathworlders made it all the more real. Yell Harris had been thrust into a conflict that was far beyond their understanding. The Deathworlders might be the ones leading the charge, but the Yell Harris would continue to fight by their side, whether they were ready or not. As the soldiers began to tend to the wounded and prepare for their return to the ships, Riva couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since the Deathworlders arrived. Yell Harris had been a planet of peace, a place where war was a distant concept. Now, they were a people forever marked by battle. Their identity had been altered, their future uncertain. The reality of what the Yell Harris had agreed to became clearer with each passing moment. They were no longer passive observers in the galaxy. They were active participants in a war that spanned across the stars. But as Riva watched her soldiers, some tending to the wounded, others silently standing guard, she realized that they had found something they hadn't had before: courage. It wasn't the kind of courage that came from training or experience, but the courage born of necessity. It was the courage to face the unknown, to stand against the enemies of the galaxy, and to protect the ones they loved. It was the courage to fight in a war that wasn't theirs, knowing that they had no choice. As the last of the Yell Harris soldiers boarded the ships, Riva took one last look at the battlefield. The scars of the fight would never fade, but the future of Yell Harris was still unwritten. They had survived their first battle, but many more awaited them. The Deathworlders would not stop their march, and neither could the Yell Harris. With a final, heavy sigh, Riva turned and walked up the ramp into the waiting ship. The doors closed behind her, and as the engines roared to life, she knew that the journey they had started would continue. The war was far from over, but Yell Harris had been forged in the fires of battle, and as long as they stood together, they would continue to fight, for survival, for honor, and for a future they had yet to define.